There we go. Okay, as I mentioned, today's session is going to be recorded. Now, before we begin, I want to cover some housekeeping items. Please leave your cameras and microphones muted throughout the session. If you have any questions, please use the chat feature. We will get to as many of them as we can at the end of the session. Or Kaitlin, I'm not sure if you want to answer questions throughout the session or at the end.
I can do either. Yeah,
Okay.
I'm happy throughout. If there's something really burning, please raise your hand or unmute and interrupt me. I'm happy to do that.
Okay, thank you. Kaitlin is the Director of Client Support and Development for Strategic Diversity Initiatives, LGBTQ, and women-owned consulting firm, and a woman-owned consulting firm. She has over 10 years of inclusive leadership experience and business innovation. With a solid corporate background in crisis and change management, she is passionate about building empowering teams and organizational cultures that interrupt systems of oppression and marginalization. Kaitlin serves as a diversity educator and on the Chancellor's Commission for LGBTQ people at the University of Tennessee, where she earned a master's degree in educational psychology with a research focus in critical HROD and queer empowerment. Her approach to social justice work balances reformist activism with mindfulness and emotional intelligence. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Kaitlin. And I didn't want to kind of not say your last name correctly. So I'm just going to say we welcome Kaitlin to this session.
Great, thank you. Yes, hi, good morning, everybody. Welcome. My name is Kaitlin Desselle. I use she, her pronouns, and I am joined this morning by Dr. Misawa, who is Associate Program Director for the Educational Psychology Department at the University of Tennessee, and also serves as chair of the Commissioners Board for LGBTQ people at the University of Tennessee as well. So I am excited to share this content with you all. Would love lots of collaboration and dialogue throughout. We'll certainly have some space at the end to do a little bit of debriefing and Q&A. And one of the things that's important to me to root this conversation in is my personal social identities and where the lens through which we will have this conversation. So I identify as a queer person. I have been a researcher and an activist and advocate for the queer community and specifically the transgender community for some years now. And I'm very much excited to talk about kind of andragogy of the oppressed and intersectionality of social identities and what the research is showing and implications for the adult ed field. So thanks for joining us today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here.
Okay. Can I say something about this?
Please,
so,
yes, go right ahead.
So good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Misawa. Like Kaitlin said, that I am at the University of Tennessee for 5 years for now. And I am the associate professor and associate departmental head of the Department of Education, Psychology, and Counseling. And also, I'm the chair of the Chancellor's Commission for LGBT people at the University of Tennessee. In addition to that, I do a lot of social justice work. I do a lot of work on the intersectionality of race, gender, and sexual orientation. So we'll talk more about this in a moment. But when Kaitlin were working on this particular project, I was her major professor. And then, this is a very, very important topic to us, especially when we think about how we develop as an adult, right? Because developmental perspective continues lifelong. And especially when we think about sexual orientation and sexual identity and gender identity, sometimes it is very, very complicated. And sometimes it depends on where you are, it can be troubling. So we are going to deconstruct what we know about adult development. We're gonna add to new knowledge, not new, but updated knowledge on queer adult identity development today. So let's share the screen. Yeah, Kaitlin.
All right.
And then, before we do that, I was gonna say something about queer identity. When we are dealing with adults, students in a college level, sometimes sexuality, sexual orientation, and gender identity are difficult to talk, right? So as an educator of adults, or higher education students, we want to make sure that we understand what is going on. So that's something that we're going to talk about today.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Misawa. So we'll go ahead and get started then. So this is queer adult identity development, implications for adult educators. We'll go ahead and move. Oh, that's not what I meant. There we go. So our agenda and objectives for today, we are going to revisit and refresh on the classical adult identity development theories and models. We will discuss the gaps and the issues in these models, essentially what's missing, with a particular focus around their role in perpetuating heteronormativity and constructs in adult education. We will explore contemporary models of queer identity and queer inclusive models. We'll discuss the implications for the adult education field, including a video that I'd love to share with you all, and hope that we can spend some time in dialogue and finish up today with a Q&A. All right, so we'll jump right into our discussion today with kind of the father of the adult identity development model, which is Eriksson. Eriksson proposed an 8-stage model to interdependence and really drew a lot of inspiration from and expanded upon the Freudian model of psychosocial development and incorporated social influences. So essentially what this model states is that crisis occurs when the ego struggles with societal demands, and that crisis is necessary to constitute a stage of development. So the focus in this model is really on trust of self and others, which is something that proves a little problematic for the queer community. We'll talk a little bit more about this. And essentially the crisis within a crisis that occurs there, and the intimate relationships that are required to develop from adolescence to adulthood. So one of the things to note about this model is that it kind of assumes a vacuum of heteronormativity. Much of the research that was conducted in these earlier days is focused around cisgender heterosexual male identity, and we'll see later with Gilligan some inclusion of cisgender heterosexual female identity as well. Next up is Levinson, who expanded Eriksson's theory, adding to the sequential model some very specific ages and stages at which these development moments happen, and a connection between self and society. So the stages were seen at this point as periods of stability and transition, and essentially Levinson argued for 4 major stages of mastery of life and developmental tasks. And this included demands of society for family and community. So one of the things that we'll discuss today is societal ideas of heteronormative family constructs and how that doesn't quite align with much of the LGBTQIA community. This also, like earlier research, applied in large ways to middle-class cisgender heterosexual white men, rendering kind of the anyone outside of that social identity, that intersection of social identities, irrelevant or invisible in the research. So Gilligan did bring some progress to adult identity development research and focusing more exclusively on women's development. So arguing for a separateness and a difference in identity development in the life course of men and women. And by this point, obviously having seen some of the societal constructs come into our understanding of personal identity development, relationship and gender roles models played a huge part in the research here, really enforcing what we think of now as a gender binary. And this research is based largely on heteronormative cisgender female identity. So here we're seeing a shift and a specific focus around female identity, but still lacking of transgender women, of gender fluid or non-conforming individuals, and of lesbian or bisexual identities as well. So some criticisms of the classical models from recent research include that these predicate normal psychological development on the lives of white American middle-class men, which is statistically a very small group, increasingly smaller group, as we know. And those experiences cannot be representative of all or others in a diverse society. And the issue of sexual orientation and coming out is greatly important during adolescence and a time of identity formation. And the need to develop formal understanding of your own identity is prompted potentially earlier for those that identify within the queer community due to a felt difference from a social norm and a sense of minority stress or otherness that we'll talk about in just a moment. And criticism of classical models is that they play a huge role in perpetuating heteronormative constructs. So they're responsible for the development of a heterosexual matrix and the rise of hegemonic heteronormative regimes that have become central to how folks focus and experience and understand their own identities, including sexual and gender identities. So some arguments for queer identity development models include suggesting that sexual minority identities, so lesbian, gay, bisexual, or other non-heterosexual identities, and reporting strong same-sex sexual or physical preferences are linked with a more advanced global, political, religious, and occupational identity development. So there being an opportunity to look at personal actualization from the lens of queer identity development and having at younger ages to reconcile with that crisis within a crisis, and that leading to a more self-actualized life for many individuals. Stewart and Newton proposed that there's actually much diversity within the LGBTQ community's perspectives on aging, including there's been a lot of research actually around benchmarking in the gay male community versus the lesbian community and benchmarks that are used for aging, such as dateability. And these are interesting to contrast in ways that we think about commonly used benchmarks for life stages and aging, such as marriage and heteronormative constructs of family. Another argument around this is minority stress, which includes shame, internalized homophobia, and disempowerment that really requires us to examine identity development models, and particularly within the context of adult education, what our responsibilities and obligations are as facilitators of adult education to incorporate pedagogy and models that account for this minority stress and create systems of support for these students. So now we'll switch gears a bit and talk about contemporary theories. These are, as an overview, stage and phase models that have a common concept of resolving an internal conflict that's related to sexual or gender nonconforming identity and moving through a process that we know as coming out. So this occurs at various stages. Most often we see this from the research in late adolescence or early adulthood, but one of the key components of these models is that the coming out process is actually, while it has clear stages, quite fluid. So what we've seen is multiple starts and stops, some regression, of course, and this one note to make here is also around the intersectionality of social identities and what that looks like for individuals who are coming out in their lives at different stages. There's a key period where an individual uses defense strategies to attempt to block recognition of non-heteronormative feelings. We call this a passing stage or strategy, coping strategies. There's a focus on emotional and physical experimentation throughout. We shift into a period of activism or pride. And then the end of these theories, the end of these models, usually we see some sort of identity resolution. So to be specific,
maybe
yeah,
sometimes
right ahead.
we said identity integration, because you really have to accept who we are in order for us to move forward. Can you go back one slide?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and then one of the things that we talked about earlier was about coming out process. So coming out process used to be thought that it is one time, like you're opening door to coming out yourself, but there are multiple doors in multiple contexts, right? So that's why it's important for us to understand that when students coming to your classroom environment, they bring their own social cultural identities with them. And sometimes they have to coming out so many times so that people know who the person is, right? So as an educator, it's important for us to create some safer environment or more inclusive environment. I say safer because there is not the safe environment, but as an educator, we can always create a safer and more inclusive environment.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that contribution, Dr. Misawa, and specifically what you said at first around identity integration. I think we see really specifically in this CAS model, and particularly the Green and Britain more recent kind of challenges to this model in asking the question of, does there have to be resolution of some sort, or can there be a more holistic integration of identity? And we'll talk hopefully in length during this session today exactly about what you just mentioned. Our responsibility as adult educators and facilitators of a psychologically safe environment for students to bring their whole selves into these learning spaces. So thank you.
Also, when we are able to integrate ourselves in terms of social cultural identities, we really have to accept who we are first. So that gets the process continues. Probably, sometimes it lasts for lifelong, but it's more like a cyclical, process going forwards, going backwards. So to me, the stage theory is so simple. It going up, and then eventually you're totally fine, but it doesn't work that way, right? Because our life is very, very complicated. So, when student comes to in your classroom, then you really need to be able to understand who they are. And also you should be able to think from their perspective. So to me, more like when we talk about adult development, especially queer adult development, we have to be more empathetic. You should be able to see something from their shoe, right? Because each person has different identities and different positionality, but it depends on the context. Your power dynamic shifts. Yes. So that gets, as an educator who has more power in the classroom environment, you need to think about how you can create a safer learning environment for your students.
Absolutely. Thank you. Something you mentioned, I think that is really powerful is the idea of individuals having to come out over and over, and sometimes that being by default because of a system that doesn't create a safer space for them to just be. For some individuals, it can be like flexing a muscle that gets stronger and more empowered in their identity and their actualization over time. But for some, it's actually like reopening a wound. So important to note here is exactly what you said, using a lens of empathy and essentially allowing individuals who are in this community to take an active role in setting the tone for where they are in their coming out journey, and that being acceptable. So
yeah,
thank you very much.
Also, you have to think about empathy-centered approach or caring-centered approach, right? Because each person has different stage of physical and psychological development, and especially for adolescents and adults, like college age people, they are sometimes confused, right? So then if you say negative thing about certain group, then maybe they don't want to become out, right? So in that case, it's important for us to be flexible and open-minded for, for self-disclosure, especially when they're talking about their own sexual orientation and gender identity. I talked about this at the different conferences before, but I identify myself as gay man, and also I'm a person of color, and I'm also, international scholar from Japan. So I myself do not just have only sexual orientation-based identity development, right? It's more like an intersectional perspective to it. So I think we're gonna talk about that in a moment, but think about that, we are not just one, we don't just have one identity, right? We have multiple identities in us, and the positionality influencing how you interact with others in a different context. So adult development is very, very closely related to social context, right? How we shape ourselves as a person with related to the society. So anyway, go ahead.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So we will jump in here then just to exploring one of the more prominent contemporary models. So the CAS model is a 6-stage LGB identity model. So this assumes the individual to play an active role in their development. It assumes separation of their private or personal and their public or public-facing social identity. And the 6 stages are beginning with identity confusion. So this exploration of who am I? And then moving into a comparison. So this otherness, this alienation, and usually this results in some feelings of inauthenticity and the need to develop a passing strategy. And then we see identity tolerance, which is experience with and experimentation with the queer community as something that's vital to survival and continued development. And then we see identity acceptance, which is where one might seek out a subculture and find affirmation and validation in their activities with the subculture. And then we see identity pride, which is a really important component of the development process. There's this dichotomy sometimes of us versus them in the queer and hetero communities. Oftentimes this stage we can see activism that is born out of a sense of otherness and maybe some feelings of frustration or anger with a system that's built to perpetuate heteronormativity. And lastly, and this is the piece we spoke about earlier, identity synthesis, meaning it's the merging of a heteronormative world and a queer identity. And the identity of queerness becomes just part of your identity holistically. So Green and Britton later on expanded on CAS's model and really focused around internalized homophobia and shame and challenged this last stage of resolution and emotional acceptance as a final synthesis stage. And to your point, Dr. Misawa really argued that this is not necessarily a linear process for many folks in the queer community, and it's not one that occurs and then we see synthesis for the rest of their lives. Oftentimes there is a cycle and stages of regression or difference in the identity development, and that there doesn't have to be a resolution of something for it to also serve as integration into their society and their context.
And then also sometimes, people experiencing this identity confusion throughout the process, right? Mm-hmm. So like, we start thinking about who am I, and then go to identity comparison, passing strategy, but still you're thinking about like, who am I, right? I think that this confusion part is kind of probably continues until the synthesis, maybe later too. So I think asking ourselves, as like who we are. I think that is the key question when we think about our own adult development, not only queer identity development, but also adult development in general, because we have a lot of responsibilities and also we have a lot of social roles, right? So depend on the roles and depend on context, maybe your identity is shifting or maybe changing throughout. So that's why it's important for us to start thinking about, to explore who we are. I think that is the key throughout the process in adult development.
Yeah, great points. And as we'll see in just a second, the reason I call this an LGB model is because there really isn't inclusion of gender nonconformity or anything about gender fluidity or being transgender in this specific model, which is a major limitation. And especially when we start talking about gender identity, one of the components that comes up is a sense of dysphoria or not identifying within the sex assigned at birth and the expression of identity, of gender identity that perhaps you have prescribed to most of your life. So that first question of identity confusion, who am I, is certainly something that if we applied this model to the gender nonconforming community, I think we would see a lot more continuously throughout. Great point, thank you. All right, so limitations, as I just said, this is a model that focused almost exclusively around research for sexual identity. So we don't see any incorporation of the transgender community, of the questioning or two-spirit community. Gender nonconformity was not something that was included in CASA's model. And we also see that queer identity is complex. There's a wide spectrum and it is quite fluid for some, and should be, a model should be inclusive versus considered alternative to heteronormativity. So social cultural identities, as Dr. Misawa mentioned just moments ago, intersectionality is not deeply addressed in this research yet. And there is a case to be made for intersectionality of marginalized identities, including in the queer community, but certainly those around classism and racism issues as well. There's limited knowledge of oppression in this model. So the hegemonic and heteronormative meta-narratives that impact access to education, health resources, community engagement, overall actualization are not widely addressed in this model. And the question is, how does marginalization impact identity development? So that's something that also is a limitation in CASA's model. So we'll talk now just a little bit about implications in adult learning. And what I'd like to do is share a video in just a moment and really take a deeper dive around some of these concepts, and then kind of open it up for dialogue and see some of the participants in this session, what have been your experiences with this from a personal lived experience or in relationship to your students or those in the adult learning community. As we've spoken about already, we create the narrative in the learning environment. And so we have an obligation to interrupt and combat the heteronormative and gender normative constructs that permeate our industry, and to cultivate inclusive learning spaces. So easy kind of lower hanging fruit ways to do this are pronoun sharing and, really focusing on gender and sexuality identity expression, inviting students and colleagues to storytell, to share about themselves and their identities, intersectionality of identities as well, and to do some conscious raising by exposure to course content and researches that lift voices of the queer community. This one is important to note that we don't tokenize. So it's important to incorporate queer voices within research and content without expecting queer participants to serve as subject matter experts necessarily on this topic. Again, that their lived experience as a queer person is just one component of their holistic identity as a person. And we should also be familiar with important terminology used in the community. We are a language-based society and words create worlds. So understanding terminology and how to respect someone's identity and how they refer to themselves is really important, as well as understanding the issues that the queer identifying students face currently. So some of these are, of course, Title IX, which I'm sure we're all familiar with within the educational realm, and Title VII, which has to do with discrimination in employment and workplace structures. So lastly, designing support needed for minority stress. Like we've already talked about, there is research that shows those that have marginalized identities encounter major challenges throughout their personal lives, and designing for a safer psychological space that meets those learners with empathy is really the responsibility and the charge for adult educators. All right, so I'm going to pull up our video, potentially. Sorry about that. Here we go. And we tested this out, so it should show sound.
Everyday struggle and think you might get attacked or something might happen to you just for being who you are.
Especially when I'm nervous and worried about professors misgendering me or using my legal name in the classroom.
And it kind of brought me to a place where I didn't want to speak up and I didn't want to be open anymore.
Are you hearing the sound as well? Okay, good.
I'm sorry to interrupt. There's no video. I think you have to share that screen.
Oh, no. Okay. Sorry about that.
We were typing it in the chat and then I realized maybe you weren't seeing that.
Thanks
so
for speaking up. Yeah.
You're
Here
welcome.
I am watching my own video.
It's a big box to unpack.
Let's see. All right, let's try this again. Sorry about that, folks. Are you able to hear the sound and see the video now?
Yeah, make your screen a little larger, like full screen.
Got it. How's that?
Perfect.
Awesome, thank you.
Every day struggle and think you might get attacked or something might happen to you just for being who you are.
Especially when I'm nervous and worried about professors misgendering me or using my legal name in the classroom.
And it kind of brought me to a place where I didn't want to speak up and I didn't want to be open anymore.
It's a big box to unpack.
I identify as gender fluid.
Queer or pansexual.
Queer trans man who is also Christian identified and white.
I identify as a dom or masculine of centered.
A trans male.
Pronouns are she, her, or kid, at which I made that up with 2 Ds. I've chosen masculine for the time being. I'm trying it out.
Poly, pansexual, transsexual,
Gender fluid.
I prefer they, them, their pronouns.
I use he, him, his pronouns.
I am gender fluid.
I identify as a queer, genderqueer, or non-binary trans person.
Her, her, and hers, they, them, and theirs.
I'm genderqueer, pansexual.
It's pansexual, and I'm also a trans man.
A lesbian.
The gay man.
And I am a non-binary trans woman of color.
FTM, so I do identify as male, but I am transgender. And then I am also asexual, probably aromantic on that scale.
Preferred gender pronouns are a big thing.
We are constantly worrying about being outed in classrooms and in counselors' offices.
Our school isn't set up so that
We have preferred names or preferred pronouns on a roster that a professor gets.
So what do you prefer to be called, or what if you're masculine centered presenting, do you identify as trans or lesbian? Do you have a preferred gender pronoun?
Getting your legal name changed is really hard or expensive to do, and it's really out of my budget.
If someone who's trans doesn't email the professor beforehand and say, hey, I know this is what it says on your roster, but actually I prefer this. And so you're essentially coming out.
Kaitlin, I'm sorry to interrupt, but the video and the audio are not syncing up.
All the classes, I would end up emailing my professors and being like,
sorry.
Okay, no, thank you for letting me know.
Okay, well, people say they can still follow. I just wanted to let you know that, you know, the hearing part of it is fine. It's just that the video and the audio don't sync up. So I don't know if you want to continue to play. Some people, I asked the question in the chat because I thought it was just me, but they're saying it's not syncing, but someone did say that they can still follow the content.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I wonder why. I'm going to keep playing, especially now that I've paused. Maybe it just needed to render a bit. But if it becomes distracting or inefficient, certainly, please interrupt me.
Okay, thank you.
can you call me this name? Can you use these pronouns?
And if you don't email them beforehand, you have a really awkward situation on your hands when they call roll.
Every day it's scary to just be in class not knowing what people are going to say.
When my professors don't notice that I have a preferred name listed in the university registry, it can be very anxiety-inducing to wonder, oh, what's going to happen on that first day of class when I'm outed? What are other students going to say? What is the teacher going to say?
People need to know that if they sign up for certain gym classes, that they will be able to go into the space. It's best for them, and they need a system where people can get preferred names on their ID cards and being able to go into a classroom the first day knowing that your birth name will not be spoken.
My school does not have a preferred name policy, so a lot of times I feel uncomfortable talking to teachers or other students, or even submitting assignments because it's not the name that I identify with.
And some of them respected that and some of them didn't. And the ones who didn't, I immediately just totally checked out of their classes and just sort of did the bare minimum to pass.
There have been classes that I've skipped intentionally because I don't feel safe going.
There have been times where I've offered, I guess, a sort of different perspective on, you know, normal gender role ideas and, you know, that kind of thing, and it was kind of met with big backlash.
Advisors sort of tried to make a safe space, but at the same time, I don't feel comfortable and supported to be myself in those situations. So sometimes when we're dealing with sensitive issues, I have kind of trouble.
A teacher misgendering me, like, oh, good morning, sir. Or, you know, students passing me, what's up, man? Things of that nature. Before I came out as gender fluid, completely misgendered. But when I encompassed the gender fluid, it made it easier for me.
So I felt like I kind of like recoiled, and I couldn't thrive, or I couldn't be as successful in that environment as I wanted to be.
There are instances where I feel unsafe, mostly because they're unmonitored or it's just not very populated. And I feel that there is an easy chance for me to be targeted as a trans person.
If it's just a simple thing about using the women's bathroom.
One of our students is a trans female, and she actually was escorted out of one of our bathrooms by a security guard.
As soon as I walk in there, I get stares, and it's hard for me to stare off those stares and, you know, counteract anything that they say or that they do.
So constantly at school, I am forced to think about the necessities of my own well-being versus thinking about my classroom and what I should be studying.
Anybody on the scale of fluidity with their gender, they need to be able to go into the bathroom that they're most comfortable with, and no one should be able to be harassed or removed by security.
I've lived in all women's dorms, and being the only guy in a women's dorm is kind of awkward.
I'm fortunate enough to be able to switch it on and off in a way that I can dress the way I want in safe places and then dress how I need to when I can't.
When I am trying to concentrate in class, but I'm trying to also map out how I can get to the restroom while being safe.
There should be family bathrooms for anyone to be able to use the bathroom. We're just going to the bathroom, you know?
There's a lot that needs to go into my campus. A lot of more acceptance.
Housing has not made much progress. I've created an entire proposal.
Always feel uncomfortable in spaces where people start mentioning how they date and they have sex, not because they're being, prejudiced against me, but because it's something I don't understand.
The person that I was communicating with no longer works there, and they haven't filled the position, and they told me just to basically wait until they could fill the position.
I wish HBCUs were more open to supporting or having resources for LGBTQ folk.
Being in the Bible Belt is something that honestly affects me because I am a religious person, but I also support gay rights 100%.
During gender studies, they try to get some of us, me included, that are in part of the LGBTQIA community to sometimes even speak out and try to teach the other students. I feel that this is wrong. Why should we ask students to tell their personal experiences?
It's just ignorance, it's just a lack of information flowing because they don't have a resource center.
Once people leave, it's like as if we were never there. Once the advisors leave that actually direct our community, it dies out. Like nobody's there to pick it up and say, okay, let me just keep on going with this.
One where dialogue is encouraged for sure.
I love enthusiastic professors.
Whenever I'm at a place and I feel safe, I feel at home, I feel like I have no care in the world and I'm only there just for my education. And that's what the whole purpose of going to college is for, right?
Hands-on environment. 100% hands-on. It doesn't really matter who I'm with.
I love something that you have to really investigate and think about.
I love analytical and critical thinking, so once we can open up the floor, we can talk about it, everybody's free to discuss, and we bounce ideas off of each other. That's a great learning environment.
He makes me feel really comfortable about who I am as a person and what I identify as.
I definitely look forward to classes that are inclusive right off the bat. So if a professor goes out of their way to make sure to establish a safe space, to establish an inclusive space, I definitely will look forward to coming back every day and learning what I have to learn in that class.
A safe environment. I know that's cheesy as it sounds, but it's honestly a safe environment is somewhere that I feel excited to learn because I feel like I can actually put my full effort into learning.
An environment where everybody's just kind and loving and accepting.
I mean, when you're just open and you're like, yeah, we got this on the board and we're doing this today, like that brings me out. That makes me feel safe to be who I am.
One particular moment, he was like, well, you have to wear a dress for speech day. I don't wear dresses, so we had to compromise and meet in the medium, and I got to wear a bow tie and slacks. And that's where I kind of got my big urge to speak out more vocally versus standing in the background.
Let people be who they are. Let people express how they want to express themselves, and most importantly, do not judge a book by its cover.
I live on campus. I'm actually living in the new gender inclusive learning community at Purdue. It's very small right now, but we're hoping to make it bigger. But I'm really excited about it. It's gonna be pretty awesome. An environment where I feel supported and where I feel like I can grow and be nurtured and be validated in all aspects of my identity. Allowing us to tell you who we are makes us feel safe as students. It makes us feel like we can learn in your classroom. It makes us feel like we can come to class.
Have a peek inside of the way the world works for us and let them know that we are a part and, we're not separate, we're here.
My name is Matt.
English.
Sean.
Kate.
Corinne.
Ms. Alicia.
Morgan.
Eric.
Nate.
Marta.
Clinton.
Charlie.
Eddie.
Pat.
Ask me.
Ask me.
Ask me.
Or ask me.
All right, so hopefully you were able to follow along with that, even if the video and audio is not syncing up necessarily. This was something that you were able to experience and get a little bit out of. I'm going to share my screen again just so that we can finish up here today. I'm seeing a lot of stuff in the chat, so thank you for your contributions. All right, so questions and contributions, and I'll look in that chat in just a second and we can start some dialogue, but how does marginalization impact identity development? Does anyone have examples of their own lived experiences or working with marginalized students or colleagues, and especially seeing how this shows up in learning spaces? Should there be separate theories? This is a question for research. Should there be a theory for heteronormative or non-queer identity development and separately queer identity development? Should we view queer identity through the lens of a multiple models approach or an inclusive spectrum approach instead? And what role does the adult education field play in navigating queer identity development? What are the obligations that we have as those that interact with individuals that are undoubtedly on the spectrum of queer identity? And what else? What other questions should we be asking? What else is missing from the research? What are pieces that come up here that we should all be thinking about and forging ahead in our dialogue around? So I'll go ahead and stop my screen share there. And I see lots of great stuff in the chat here. And I'll encourage anyone who wants to, or Dr. Misawa, if there's anything you'd like to add, feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself and add to the dialogue here. So. Ask students to fill out index card with their chosen names and pronouns before calling roll on the first day. It's a really great best practice. Nicole says she does something similar. Ask them to fill out an information sheet and avoids outing anyone. They have an option at the bottom to request to have a conversation about it. That's something that I've seen, including my time as a student of Dr. Misawa's, in the syllabus that's sent out inevitably before the first day of class, you know, calling out specifically that this is inclusive space and inviting for students to reach out and share their pronouns or how they would like to be addressed that may differ from what's in the university system. And I think in my experience, it really varies if the university system has a specific protocol for name change. And as the video called out, legal name change is a process for queer identifying individuals that is actually quite cumbersome. So many students are not in a position to be able to do that. So it's important to give that space in the beginning. Yeah, this is really great. I would never have guessed it, but it's a struggle to phase out "you guys," someone says in the chat, but it's really made a difference. Plus, y'all is fun to say, and you all and folks works most of the time. Absolutely. That's something I've actually been on the journey of correcting a lot of my own language. And instead of saying "you guys" or assuming someone's pronouns, using more neutral or "y'all" is a great go-to. Very good.
I don't know, Brianna, if you can talk or not, but your comment is very interesting to me. The difference between PWIs and the HBCU LGBTQ+ resources.
Yeah. As well, I've worked in student support services, actually, in PWIs and HBCUs, and it's definitely a vast difference as far as just resources that are available to the LGBTQ plus community. Even just in the video, they mentioned residential resources, community resources of that nature. That's pretty much an unheard of thing at HBCUs, and I suspect that it's because the majority of HBCUs are in the Bible Belt, which traditionally have more conservative views as far as just different resources that are available to marginalized students. So yeah, it's definitely a vast difference as far as resources that are available to those students versus students that are a part of the more majority groups. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing.
No problem.
I identify myself as a gay person of color, but I'm at the, predominantly white institution now. And sometimes I wonder still about, there's some assumptions about LGBTQ plus community and then people of color community, because every time I try to visit the resource center, I don't see many of LGBTQ student of color at this point, I think. And some traditional research was extensively conducted by using the sample of white population. So that's why probably intersectionality is probably important thing to think about. Like from my own experiences, when I was undergraduate to graduate school, I don't think I belong to certain group. So I still feel like I'm the culture of one. Sometimes if I go to LGBTQ resource center, yes, they probably give me resources about LGBTQ plus stuff. And then if I have to think about my racial perspective, then I have to go to another community to get the resources, for example. So, sometimes that as a school administrator or maybe staff or faculty people, we have to think about, again, we are multiple identity people, right? We don't have just one identity. So, we need to start thinking about how we as adults develop our own self throughout the life, not only one particular identity, but also others. I think that it's probably important for us to think about. Kaitlin?
Yeah, and I also would love to just respond to something else that's in the comments here that Adam adds, which is the importance of the double-edged sword and the concept of passing versus visibility, which I think is that also makes me think about intersectionality of identity and the ways that we take up space in several different communities and what that manifests as in our identity development. But specifically here, Adam says, queer cisgender men who may have effeminate mannerisms may experience something different than passing straight men, and the former may be subjected to more overt discrimination, while the latter will likely be exposed to casual homophobia. Both experiences are powerful negative forces for shaping identity, internalized shame. And that's a really great point. I'll share that my partner is a transgender man, and I met him just before he started his transition. And I would report that he experiences a significantly higher amount of covert discrimination and is assumed to be a cisgender man in his presentation and is therefore invited into a lot of moments and conversation around homophobia that are deeply hurtful and traumatic for him versus when he was passing as a straight expressing cisgender female before. So that's a really great point you bring up, Adam. I appreciate that contribution. covert discrimination and being invited into moments of homophobia. Yeah, thank you.
And then, when we think about sexual identity and gender identity, it is more like a invisible identity to some people. So, as an educator, we really need to be able to create a safer environment so that the people will still be able to share their life experiences. Especially for adults, they have a lot of experiences throughout their life. And sometimes, they need a place to disclose, themselves. And sometimes talking helps, I think, like counseling, right? Talking to people helps. And then if you have a, effective community of practice, then most likely people are able to survive in the educational setting, like higher education, like we are in.
Yeah, thank you. What else? Any other ideas from the group around our positionality as adult educators and what kind of responsibilities we should adhere to in creating safer and inclusive environments in our classrooms or institutionally speaking in higher education?
Sometimes the policy influencing what we can do, I think. I'm in Tennessee. State of Tennessee is not friendly to LGBTQ plus population, especially in higher education. Like I said earlier, I'm the chair of the Chancellor's Commission for LGBT people at the flagship institution of University of Tennessee. Still, we have Commission for Women, Commission for Blacks, and also Commission for Disability. They are able to use the state funding to do their event. But for us, Commission of LGBT people, we are not able to use state funding. So we have a private, account money, I guess. Then we have to use that money to the events. So again, it's a politically discriminated, but still, it depends on context and policy that you have, then our culture changes. For me, in a state of Tennessee, I guess at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, I try to help students to do some self-care. Because like somebody said about internal homophobia, that affects people a lot. That case, they really have to care themselves for somehow, right? Like talking to people, talking to a counselor, or they have to find something that they need to do to be able to sustain their mental health. So nowadays, I think mental health is also the issue, right? So as an educator, we need to be able to take care of your own students, I guess. That's important. And the caring-centered and empathy-centered practice are probably the way that we probably need to rethink about, how we can implement into our current education system, I think.
Yeah, there's some contributions around substantiating your experience in Tennessee as well. I would say that as a student as well, I definitely can say that has been my experience. And we recently were publicized as one of the least LGBTQ friendly universities in the country. And I'm very happy to say that at least for the Chancellor's Commission of LGBTQ people, that really sparked the desire to have kind of an audit of a lot of systemic practices and lack of support and ways that we can take some strategic actions around creating a more inclusive environment. So
Kaitlin, not the worst yet. I think worst in a public institution. Yeah. There's another private institution was the worst. I think second worst. But yeah, that's not the good news for us.
Yeah.
Yes.
Agreed. Yeah. So suggestions for everyone. Thank you for that invitation. So I think from the PowerPoint, especially, one of the things that is really important are to create, think about your circle of control, your circle of influence as educators. Much of the decision-making process and the funding and the systemic pieces are not necessarily within our locus of control, but creating really intentional, safer space by kind of doing an audit of your own practices and pronoun sharing, and creating an environment through written text and verbal confirmation that sends a signal to students who are queer identifying that this is safe space and that you are welcome to talk with me about your needs, and know that you'll be supported and empowered to express how you identify in my classroom space or in my department. And, you know, acting as an ally. I think that part of the work that I do is kind of assisting folks with learning how to practice allyship. And that looks like having some very difficult but necessary, messy, emotionally intelligent conversations, and interrupting bias when we see it, and having the hard conversations. So not to be too nebulous, but I think that's a really good start for anyone who's looking to act as an ally to the LGBTQ community. It's creating opportunities for you to be seen as an ally, and bringing to the conversation the voices of the folks who have ideas and lived experiences that should be highlighted, using privilege and positionality to create space for marginalized individuals is the best way I think that you could act as an ally. So safe zone training. Yep, I've seen this as well. Allies and instructors can add this designation to their email signature and post outside the office doors. Yeah, that's a great idea. Absolutely. Something as simple as adding your pronouns to your email signature, or when you log into a Zoom, if you're educating or meeting virtually. These things are signals, really, and they matter to folks that are constantly having to scan their environment and their horizon for friend or foe, for safety or threat, because they're navigating a heteronormative world. So yeah, thank you for that. Wish it were mandatory. Yeah, that's you know, one of those more systemic pieces that take a lot of voices in the room, but mandating some sort of training around safe zone and allyship is definitely, I would say, a best practice that we can all aspire to someday. So very good. Anything else? Any other questions for me or for Dr. Misawa, or important components to add to the dialogue? I know we'll be finishing up a little early. Stephanie says being open-minded and realizing that the coming out process can be difficult is important. When I talk about my ex-husband, often continue a conversation, eventually talk about my girlfriend. So I come out as queer, and sometimes the looks I get are enough to shut me down. Self-discovery really never stops. How am I supposed to be myself and feel comfortable talking to that person later about my non-binary identity? Absolutely. I think that's kind of a piece of what Dr. Misawa was saying earlier, and this continuous need to keep coming out in spaces, and recognition for those that are not in the queer community, that can be really empowering to some folks. And a form of activism for some, but can also be like reopening a wound, and especially a continuous reaction to that says you're not welcome to come out here, you're not welcome to be your authentic self here, is that other, that minority stress and that dysphoria and that otherness that so many face. So thank you for sharing that, Stephanie. We have a long ways to go, but it was a great start. Yeah, and I think that is kind of the goal, is to start somewhere and to build momentum and keep it as topic of conversation. Interestingly, I can't recall the facts exactly, so I hesitate to share the number, but I want to say recently a Gallup survey actually showed that like 16% of Gen Z identify as gender nonconforming. So this, queer identity is not going away. Queer identity has always existed, and being in the age of information sharing and social media and connectivity, I think that we've seen this surge in ability for folks to be visible and to self-identify and forge connection and activism. And more so than ever, we're seeing younger folks coming out and demanding a seat at the planning tables and asking for the spaces where they're allowed to authentically identify and thrive. So we've got to start somewhere, and building that momentum is really important for those of us who are currently in positions of decision making or stewards of adult learning, especially. So the kids are all right.
Starting point is good. I think that is the way we need to start, but I think continuation is the issue sometimes, right? So keep consistent. I think that is probably the important perspective, especially if we want to, have a social justice perspective into your institution, I think. And it has to be institutionalized. Yes, once you start it, then probably you have to keep doing it. Yeah, I think that is probably important.
Yeah. Yeah, and Megan notes that their research focus is around LGBTQ plus issues in high school, and that there's the current political climate and policy attacks on specifically trans folks is really something to note. The sports bills and the recent legislation in the state of Arkansas, which is arguably the most damaging for trans youth, for sure. So what makes, as Dr. Misawa said earlier, social context, political context, all of those things are hugely important in identity development. And I would question then, Megan and anyone else who'd like to add, what does that mean for us as adult educators who will inherit those high school students that are currently struggling to identify in a world where they're seeing the legal system and the structures that are designed and built against them and their authentic existence. So those are major implications for us to have awareness of that and design spaces that will act against some of the traumas that definitely occur with as you said, the polarized political climate and legal climate. Thank you for that ad.
Megan, I really suggest that you do this type of research. I think that is very, very important. So I did my master's degree in the University of Alaska around 2000-ish, and I did study on LGBTQ people on campus in higher education. And I built up the study to focusing on more higher education setting, focusing on faculty people when I did my PhD at the University of Georgia. So still, we really need have this kind of research to establish the scholarship. Also, the scholarship will help us what we can do in our practice. So I'm looking forward to reading your work in the future, Megan. Thanks.
No pressure, no pressure. Thank you.
No pressure.
Yeah, exactly. I'm excited to do the research, so thank you.
Good, great dialogue. Thank you. Well, Dr. Misawa, is there anything else that you have to add? I will, as a kind of last component here, share my screen again and just I'd be remiss if I did not share our references from today's session. So I just want to make those available to those that are interested in some further resources. Someone did ask just a few moments ago if they could get the link to the Chronicles of Higher Education video that we saw today. So I did drop that in the chat there. Hopefully you were able to grab that and use it as a resource moving forwd. And these
Kaitlin,
are,
sorry about that. Let me kind of stop my video. I think might be some feedback there, but if you're willing to share your PowerPoint, and if you add that link, when you send it over or add it to the PowerPoint slide, excuse me, we're going to share whatever information that the presenters want us to share to the attendees.
Oh, great, excellent.
They will get that as well.
So that video link is embedded in the slides and is included in the references there. So yeah, I'd be happy to share that over and you all can distribute.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, folks, for an engaging conversation. I've really enjoyed it and looking forward to joining you again in the future.
Thank you both. We want to thank both of our presenters for a great session. I learned a lot during the session, so thank you so much. And I want to thank all of our attendees for attending, and also please feel free to join us for our closing session. There is a session that is going on right now, and it is our student panel. So please feel free to join that, and then I will be following up right after that. Again, thank you everyone for attending, and thank our panelists. Y'all have a great, awesome rest of your day. Bye, everybody.
Bye, thank you.